You didn't go silent to punish them. You went silent to finally hear yourself again. You blocked them. You stopped replying. You went completely silent, and deep down, you expected them to come after you. But they didn't, at least not in the way you imagined. Now you're stuck questioning everything. Did you make a mistake? Does the avoidant actually not care? Did you never really matter to them at all? Pause there, because that thinking misses the real picture completely. What actually happens inside an avoidant mind during your absence is far more layered than most people realize. And once you understand it, you stop seeing things in such a simple, they care or they don't way. When you go no contact with someone with an avoidant pattern, you're not dealing with someone who feels nothing. You're triggering a deep psychological shift that most people never get to witness because they usually break contact too soon. They message again, they explain themselves, they chase clarity, and in doing that, they interrupt the process before it unfolds naturally. So if you're in no contact right now, thinking about it, or trying to make sense of why things went quiet, pay attention. Because what happens next inside them unfolds in stages. And the part most people misunderstand is this. When you first disappear, their first response is not heartbreak or panic. It's not even sadness. It's relief. And yes, that can feel painful to accept. But that relief doesn't mean you were meaningless. It means their nervous system is finally coming out of pressure mode. For someone with avoidant patterns, closeness often feels overwhelming on a body level. Not just emotional discomfort, but actual internal tension, like being too exposed, too close, too expected of. So while you were in contact, even if things looked calm on the outside, there was often an undercurrent of stress inside them. When you step away, that pressure drops. Silence feels light. Space feels safe. And that is why the first reaction can look like ease. But that ease doesn't last the way people assume it will. After a few days, something starts to shift. The relief is still there on the surface, and externally they may look fine. They might distract themselves, socialize, post normally, and act like nothing changed. This is the part that confuses people the most, because it looks like they've moved on instantly. But underneath that surface, the mind begins to register something new: your absence. Not your control, not your emotional intensity, not the pressure, but the actual gap you left behind. Slowly, thoughts begin to surface. Small memories, familiar habits, the way you used to check in, certain conversations that felt easy, moments where they felt understood, even if they didn't know how to stay with it. At this stage, they still won't reach out. The avoidance system is still active. It still links closeness with discomfort, so even the urge to reconnect gets pushed down immediately. They rationalize it. They tell themselves it was just habit, nothing real, nothing important. They minimize what they felt so they can stay in control of their emotional space. But suppressed emotion doesn't disappear. It just moves deeper. As time continues, usually around the second week, if there's consistent silence, the internal story starts to weaken. The logic they used to justify distance, it was too much, I needed space, this wasn't right for me, starts to feel less solid. Because now the absence is no longer just relief, it becomes comparison. They begin remembering not only what felt heavy, but also what felt warm. Not only the pressure, but also the connection. And that contrast creates inner conflict they don't easily express outwardly. This is where things become complicated inside them, because two opposing forces start existing at the same time: the need for space and the growing awareness of what your presence actually meant. And most of this happens quietly, without any immediate action, which is why it's so often misunderstood from the outside. And avoidant individuals are not people who easily allow themselves to sit with good feelings. So when those memories start coming back, they don't land in a smooth or comforting way. They feel strange, almost unfamiliar, like something they can't fully trust. At this point, some avoidant individuals begin what's often described as a proximity test. It's not direct contact in the way most people think. It's subtle, almost invisible if you're not paying attention. It might be watching your stories without saying anything, liking an old post late at night, sending a random, low-meaning message that doesn't really open anything emotionally, something they can easily dismiss if your response feels like it carries too much weight. Something safe, something controllable. But this isn't real reconnection. It's distance-controlled contact, like checking whether the emotional weather has changed without stepping fully outside. And if you respond with too much intensity, too much familiarity, too much emotional availability, they often pull back again. Not because they don't feel something, but because their nervous system reads your warmth as a sudden return of pressure. And that pressure activates their retreat response. This is also the stage where behavior can look completely contradictory from the outside. Some avoidant individuals may suddenly get involved with someone new, or reconnect with an ex, or start dating again quickly. And from the outside, it looks like proof that nothing mattered. But internally, it's often an attempt to recreate connection in a way that feels safer, less emotionally loaded, less demanding, less tied to history. A new person doesn't carry expectations yet. There's no emotional history, no shared vulnerability to manage. It feels simpler, more controllable. At first, that can seem like relief, but the same patterns tend to reappear. Emotional distance returns. Walls come back up. The cycle repeats itself, just in a different setting. And this is where a deeper misunderstanding usually happens. Avoidant patterns are not built around one specific person. They are not a reaction to you personally. You were not too much, not too emotional, not too intense. You were simply in connection with someone whose system struggles with sustained emotional closeness, regardless of who is in front of them. That's not an excuse for behavior. It's an explanation of structure. And understanding structure gives clarity instead of confusion. By the 3rd to 4th week of no contact, if silence has been consistent, something shifts again internally. The absence is no longer new. It's no longer a relief. It stops being something they can casually ignore. It becomes noticeable in a different way, more like a weight in the background of daily life. And for someone who has built their entire emotional coping system around disconnecting from weight, this creates an unfamiliar internal experience, because now they can't fully switch it off. They can distract themselves, they can stay busy, they can move toward other people or other routines, but something still remains underneath it all. And it often starts in very small, almost dismissible thoughts. What are they doing now? They probably moved on. Why haven't they reached out? And eventually, something deeper begins to surface beneath those thoughts. What if I actually lost them? That is where the emotional shift becomes more serious, because at a deeper level, avoidant patterns are not just about avoiding closeness. They are also shaped by a fear of loss, of being replaced, abandoned, or ultimately not being enough to keep someone present. So when silence continues without interruption, it doesn't just create distance, it creates uncertainty. And uncertainty is something the avoidant mind struggles to fully control. At this stage, they may not openly express anything. Most of it stays internal or comes out indirectly. They might mention you casually in conversation without admitting why. They might check in through mutual connections under the guise of curiosity. They might revisit places tied to shared memories without fully acknowledging what they're doing. They might start and delete messages repeatedly, caught between impulse and fear. Not because they don't feel anything, but because acting on it would mean stepping into emotional exposure again, and that is exactly what their system resists. This is also the phase where many people break no contact too early, not realizing they were closer than they thought to a real emotional shift. Because in this stage, the avoidant is no longer just pushing away. They are also confronting, often for the first time in a long while, the actual emotional impact of the connection they experienced. And interrupting that process changes everything again. It gives them an escape route. It allows them to calm their system again without ever staying in the discomfort long enough for it to actually transform anything inside them. But there is a deeper part of this conversation that matters even more, because everything discussed so far has focused on what is happening inside the avoidant mind. And while that insight can be powerful, it is only half of the picture. The real question isn't just what they are experiencing, it's what is happening inside you. because no contact rarely begins as some deeply informed psychological strategy. Sometimes it does, but often it starts from confusion, frustration, or advice from others. Stop texting, pull away, make them miss you, disappear and they will come back. But at some point in that silence, something shifts internally for you as well. And this is where things get important. When no contact is done consistently and not broken in the middle, it slowly starts to regulate your nervous system again. Because being in connection with an avoidant pattern often keeps your system in a constant state of tension. You become hyper-aware without even realizing it. You check tone in messages. You overanalyze delays. You start questioning your own behavior every time they pull back. You adjust yourself emotionally just to avoid triggering distance. You start managing the relationship instead of living it. And over time, that creates exhaustion that you don't fully recognize until the pressure is removed. Then silence begins, and something interesting happens. When you stop reaching out, stop checking messages repeatedly, stop waiting for replies, stop crafting the perfect version of yourself to keep things stable, your system starts to settle. Slowly at first, but noticeably. In that settling, clarity begins to return. You start remembering what you felt like before this dynamic took over your emotional space. You remember how it felt to connect with someone who didn't make closeness feel like something you had to earn or carefully maintain. You remember versions of yourself that weren't constantly analyzing, adjusting, or second-guessing. And as that clarity returns, the emotional grip of the avoidant pattern begins to weaken. Not because they become less real as a person, but because they become less central in your inner world. And that shift is important, because you start to see something that was hard to see while you were inside the emotional cycle. You realize you weren't only attached to who they actually were in the present, you were also attached to what the relationship felt like it could become in its best moments. Especially in the beginning, when everything felt easier, when attention was warmer, when connection felt more available, when it seemed like things might naturally deepen. That early version creates a kind of emotional blueprint in your mind. And when things change later, the mind keeps trying to return to that earlier version, even if the current reality no longer matches it. That gap between what was and what you hoped it would become is where a lot of emotional attachment actually lives. And recognizing that is not about blame. It's about clarity. Now, stepping back into the avoidant side for a moment, after several weeks of consistent silence, often around 5 or 6 weeks or more, your absence is no longer something they are actively reacting to. It becomes part of their new normal. And at that stage, two general paths tend to appear. The first is emotional shutdown. In this case, the avoidant mind fully disconnects from the emotional weight of the relationship. The feelings are not processed in depth. They are contained, minimized, or pushed aside. On the outside, it can look like complete moving on. Life continues, routines return, and the relationship appears to lose importance. But that external appearance can be misleading, because what looks like no impact is often just a different way of processing impact, through distance rather than reflection. The second path is more rare, but it does happen under the right conditions. This is when emotional discomfort grows strong enough that avoidance is no longer fully effective. In that space, reflection begins to break through the defenses, and sometimes that leads to contact. But that contact is not the end of the pattern. It is simply the moment where the pattern becomes visible. Because reaching out does not automatically mean emotional change has occurred. It often just means the internal tension between longing and fear has temporarily shifted toward longing. And fear has a way of returning the moment closeness feels real again. This is why what happens next matters more than the outreach itself. If an avoidant returns after no contact, the most important thing is not to fall immediately back into the previous emotional dynamic. Not because warmth is wrong, but because urgency, emotional flooding, or immediate full reconnection tends to reactivate the same cycle. Warmth without pressure creates space. Urgency recreates pressure. And pressure is what their system reacts to. So, if reconnection is ever explored, it has to move at a pace that allows both sides to remain emotionally regulated rather than pulled back into old patterns. Because without that shift in structure, nothing actually changes. Only the cycle repeats in a slightly different form. You show them you're okay, that your world didn't collapse when they went silent, that you're not sitting around waiting for them to return, even if a part of you still misses them. Because for someone with avoidant patterns, emotional safety often comes from distance, but emotional attraction grows when they sense you are not emotionally dependent on their presence. When they feel you are steady, grounded, and not chasing, you become less overwhelming to their system. Not because you are playing a game, but because you are no longer presenting as pressure. And only from that kind of mutual emotional steadiness does anything real even have a chance to form. But this is the part that needs to be understood clearly. Returning to an avoidant should never be the purpose of no contact. No contact is not meant to be a tactic to pull someone back. When it becomes that, you turn your own healing into a strategy, and you place your emotional well-being in a waiting room that someone else controls. And in that kind of dynamic, you lose more than you gain. At its core, no contact, when it's healthy and intentional, is about you. It creates distance from the emotional chaos long enough for you to actually see the relationship for what it was, not what you hoped it would be, not what it briefly felt like in the beginning, and not what you kept trying to turn it into, but what it actually was. And from that clarity, real decisions become possible. Not anxious decisions, not decisions driven by fear of loss or loneliness, but decisions rooted in self-respect and awareness of what you truly need in a relationship. Because you deserve something simple, even if it isn't always easy. Someone who chooses you without needing to be pulled into it. Someone whose presence doesn't depend on your shrinking. Someone who doesn't treat closeness like a threat they have to escape from. Healthy connection isn't the absence of fear. It's the ability to move through fear together instead of using distance as protection from it. And it's easy to forget this when you're in the middle of emotional confusion, when your phone feels like a source of anxiety, when you're replaying conversations, when you're wondering what you did wrong, and when you start shrinking yourself just to keep the connection from breaking. But avoidant individuals are not bad or emotionally empty people. Most of them are deeply sensitive in ways they were never given safety to express. At some point early in life, emotional expression may have felt unsafe, overwhelming, or unwelcome. So they adapted. They learned to disconnect, to self-regulate through distance, to protect themselves by limiting closeness. That strategy once helped them survive emotionally, but in adult relationships, it often creates distance from the very connection they actually want. So when you step back, when you stop pursuing, when you stop trying to fix, convince, or carry the emotional weight of the connection alone, you are not abandoning them. You are stepping out of a role you were never meant to carry, because no amount of love can heal someone who is not willing or ready to face what is underneath their pattern. That work has to be chosen. It cannot be done for them. Some people will never choose it, and that has nothing to do with your worth. Some will only choose it after time, discomfort, or reflection makes avoidance harder than awareness. And a smaller number will reach a point where they confront themselves, do the work, and come back with a level of honesty that wasn't available before. But none of that is something you can control. And the moment you truly understand that, not just as an idea, but in your body, you stop living in emotional suspension, waiting for someone else's change to determine your peace. Your responsibility is not to wait for someone to become emotionally available. Your responsibility is to become clear about what emotional availability actually looks like for you, and to stop accepting relationships that require you to constantly question your place in them. If you are in that silence right now, or just coming out of a relationship that felt confusing, inconsistent, or emotionally unstable, understand this. The space you're in is not empty. It's recovery. It's where your nervous system begins to settle again after being stretched into constant alertness. It's where you stop scanning someone else's behavior for meaning and start reconnecting with your own. It's where you begin to hear yourself again. And in that space, something very important starts to return: your sense of self. You remember what you actually want, not what you adapted yourself to tolerate. You remember that needing consistency isn't too much. You remember that love shouldn't feel like guessing. You remember that being chosen shouldn't feel uncertain. And slowly, the emotional grip of the avoidant pattern begins to lose its power. Not because the person becomes unimportant, but because you become more anchored in yourself than in their response. So hold the silence, not as a strategy, not as a way to provoke a reaction, but as a return to yourself. Because the most important shift that happens in no contact is not whether they come back, it's whether you do. In the end, this is not really a story about avoidant attachment. It is a story about clarity. Because no contact was never meant to be a tool to control someone else's feelings or force a reaction. It was meant to remove you from emotional confusion long enough for truth to become visible again. And when the noise quiets down, two things start to happen at the same time. You stop over-interpreting someone else's silence, and you start hearing your own. You begin to see that the anxiety you were living in was not love itself, but the strain of trying to hold on to something inconsistent. And in that space, your nervous system slowly returns to itself. Maybe the avoidant thinks about you. Maybe they don't. Maybe they reach out. Maybe they don't. But none of those outcomes can be the center of your life anymore. Because what actually matters is that you are no longer building your emotional stability around someone who cannot consistently meet you in it. And that realization changes everything. You stop negotiating your needs. You stop shrinking to stay connected. You stop mistaking uncertainty for depth. And you start understanding that real love does not require you to abandon yourself in order to keep it. Some people will come back. Some will not. Some will grow. Some will repeat the same patterns, but your life cannot stay suspended in any of those possibilities. The purpose of the silence was never to make someone return. It was to bring you back to yourself. And once you return to yourself, you don't need to chase clarity anymore. You become it. That is where the real ending happens, not with their response, but with your awakening.